All right, folks. I wanted to make a quick video talking about the upcoming fight between Jake Paul and Hasim Rahman Jr. coming up on Saturday, August 6th. It's going to be held at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Now, this is going to be a cruiserweight bout, so the weight limit is going to be 200 pounds. Jake Paul currently is 5 wins and 0 losses with 4 knockouts. Hasim Rahman Jr. is 12-1 with 6 knockouts. Now, I think until this point, Jake Paul has been very carefully matched. He fought Nate Robinson, who is a smaller guy, who was a basketball player. He fought Ben Askren, who obviously was in the UFC, but he comes from a wrestling background, so he was never really much of a threat in terms of boxing and in terms of striking. And then Jake Paul's last 2 fights were against Tyrone Woodley. Again, UFC guy, but coming from primarily a wrestling background. Not a devastating striker, Jake Paul, to his credit, he's athletic. He's a strong guy. He's proven himself to be pretty durable as a boxer. So he can get in with these guys who have some striking experience, but none of these guys were high-level boxers. Now, Hasim Rahman Jr., on the other hand, he's a legit professional boxer. How good is he? Well, let's take a quick look at his record. He is, as I said, he's 12-1. He has 6 knockouts. So he's not a crazy knockout puncher. 3 of his knockouts came in his first 3 fights. 2 of those guys were making their professional debut, and one of the guys he knocked out was 4-11. He has a majority decision against a guy who was 3-10. He has a unanimous decision against guys who were 26-21, 3-19, 5-3, 1-8. And his only defeat is coming from his last fight, which was at the end of April 29th, against James Mackenzie Morrison, who's the son of former heavyweight boxing champion Tommy Morrison. Hasim Rahman Jr. was knocked out. He was stopped in the 5th round. So, Hasim Rahman Jr., he has the name, he has the pedigree, but he really hasn't shown himself in the ring to be that great of a fighter. But when stacked up against the people that Jake Paul's fought, I think Hasim Rahman Jr. would beat any of those guys in a boxing match. So he's clearly the best opponent that Jake Paul's had to date. But one key factor here is Hasim Rahman Jr. is a heavyweight. So he's going to have to drop down to 200 pounds. Now, as recently as February of 2021, Hasim Rahman Jr. weighed in for his fight at 269 pounds. Now, in fairness, that was his first fight post-pandemic, so maybe he wasn't the most disciplined guy and he blew up in weight during the pandemic, because to his credit, in his next fight, which was only 4 months later, he was all the way down to 224 pounds. But clearly this is a guy that's used to carrying around a little bit of weight, so having to drop down all the way to 200 pounds, I think is going to be too much for him. He's going to be a shell of himself. He's already shown himself not to be the biggest puncher, which would be the biggest threat to Jake Paul. Jake Paul's fighting at a weight that he's comfortable with, so his power is going to be there. His stamina is going to be there. Rahman Jr., if he's not the biggest puncher against really inexperienced guys at his natural weight, how is he going to be coming down 25 pounds? I don't think the power is going to be there. The stamina. Now, Hasim Rahman Jr. has never fought past 6 rounds. His last fight against James Morrison was scheduled for 10 rounds, but Rahman was stopped in the fifth round. He does have a couple 6 round fights that went the distance, but he's never fought past the 6 rounds. So my official prediction here is Jake Paul wins by decision. I think is the most likely outcome. And if he doesn't win by a decision, I think he could possibly stop Hasim Rahman Jr. Late in the fight. If Rahman gasses out, Jake Paul catches him, he could go down. It could get waved off. We'll see, but credit to both guys. They're taking the fight. It's clearly the highest level opponent that Jake Paul's faced to date. But I think the outcome is almost a foregone conclusion. So, what do you all think? Do you really think Hasim Rahman Jr. has a chance here? Is this guy even at the level he's at? Is he just too good for Jake Paul? Am I completely off base here? So let me know what you all think. I'll see you on the next one.